We are in a series studying Genesis, and a few weeks ago, I mentioned the ancient cities Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zor. If you were here that Sunday, you might remember they were the 5 nerdy kids playing Magic the Gathering in the analogy I gave when the bullies from northern Mesopotamia came down, took their lunches, and beat them up. I received some feedback from a few of you that you felt a little targeted with that analogy. Maybe you wondered whether that was intentional or not. It was intentional. What are you going to do about it? Now give me your lunch money. No, I'm kidding. Anyways, I mentioned that Sunday that those relatively small cities, they're all next to each other, have been traditionally assumed to be on the southern side of the Dead Sea, but that more recent archaeological evidence suggests they may have been on the northern side. Here's why. Researchers and archaeologists from 7 universities have been studying this region of the Jordan Valley, north of the Dead Sea, because of an odd and difficult to explain archaeological record. The evidence shows there were a number of cities that inhabited this fertile plain for thousands of years, and then suddenly, sometime during what's called the Middle Bronze Age, so maybe 1700 BC, these cities were then uninhabited and remained uninhabited for some 500 to 700 years. So what catastrophic event would not only destroy the cities in this region, but make the previously fertile area uninhabited or unable to be uninhabited for 500 to 700 years? One of the universities conducting the research is actually based out of Albuquerque, and they've uncovered a possible answer, although the research is ongoing. They've uncovered clay pottery fragments dated back to the Middle Bronze Age in this area that are on one side melted almost like glass, but then not on the other, which suggests a very short burst of extreme heat. Very short burst of extreme heat, and they argue the cause could have been either a meteor impacting the Earth or what's called an airburst, which is when a meteor explodes in the atmosphere, devastating through a short burst of extreme heat everything below. If that seems sort of crazy, well, it is. And it's exactly what happened in 1908 in the forests of Siberia when a meteor burst in the air, devastating all trees and vegetation over 830 square miles. But please, have a wonderful walk outside today. As if we need to learn more ways we could die. Anyways, we don't know with certainty that Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities were on the northern end of the Dead Sea, so we don't know if the archaeological research going on there is relevant, but it's most definitely intriguing. Certainly, by the time Genesis was actually written down, which would have been hundreds of years after any of the events it describes, Israelites knew whether north or south, the area around the Dead Sea was uninhabitable, and in Genesis 18 and 19, we hear their story of how it came to be. Verse 16, then the men set out from there, and they looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. So let's just stop right here. If it looks like we're in the middle of a story, it's because we are, sort of. In the 15 verses before this of chapter 18, we learn that 3 here called men, but we learn in those verses that one of them was actually a physical representation of God, the other 2 his angels or messengers. They appeared to Abraham promising a son to be born his wife Sarah in a year's time. Now that in the narrative is a very big deal. It's a very big deal in our narrative so far because there was this gap that we talked about, this large gap between God's promises and Abraham and Sarah's reality. God's promises were for offspring and descendants beyond their ability to count. Their reality was barrenness and old age. And as they got older and older, that gap only appeared more and more unbridgeable. So in the verses before our passage begins, God and his 2 messengers, in the appearance of men, pronounced the imminent pregnancy of Sarah. And then in this verse, they move on towards their second reason for the visitation, hinted at by the phrase, they looked towards Sodom. Let's continue. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? No, for I've chosen him, that he may charge his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, how very grave their sin. I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. Now this is interesting, isn't it? This last line here. I mean, what information could God collect about Sodom and Gomorrah that he doesn't already have? Doesn't God know everything? There are a couple possibilities here, and we're about to get a little theological. On the one hand, this text could be teaching us that although God could or can know everything, well, he chooses not to at times. He doesn't need to learn anything, but if he wants to learn, he can. He can temporarily set aside or limit his omniscience. Omniscience or omniscience is the knowledge of everything in order to learn things. Why would God set aside his omniscience to learn things? For relationship. Relationship involves discovery, involves learning, involves getting to know. And so, though God has the ability to know every fact that can be known, he might at times purposefully limit his knowledge for the sake of relationship. Maybe that's what's happening here. The other possibility is that the text is not trying to say something about God's omniscience, but to say something about God's justice. Justice demands a thorough investigation. Justice doesn't just listen to one side of a matter and then render a judgment. No, it searches, it probes. That's why a court case is called a hearing. The idea is that everything that can be heard should be heard. And so perhaps that's what's happening. It's not that God is going on a fact-finding mission for himself, but a fact-finding mission for Abraham, for all witnesses, for us even today, that we might be convinced of God's justice. Let's move on. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham came near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not forgive it for the 50 righteous who are in it? You know, small cities like Sodom in the ancient world were about 100 people in population. So he's essentially saying, would you really destroy the city if half were righteous? He continues, far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fares the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Now that phrase, far be it, repeated by Abraham, sounds pretty strong. It doesn't quite capture the original Hebrew. The root word translated far be it or far be that is the word for profane. And something profane is the opposite of something holy. So Abraham is saying, profanity, the opposite of holiness, for you to do such a thing. You know, the ancient Greeks told a story about the Titan god Prometheus, who famously took pity on humans. And so he defied Zeus by stealing fire from the heavens and giving it to humanity. And as a result of his defiance, Prometheus was bound to a stake to have his liver eaten by an eagle day after day until finally rescued by Hercules. Now, although the stories are completely different, you could perhaps call Abraham's action Promethean, standing up to God for the sake of humanity. But here's the key difference, besides every detail in the story. The Greeks never thought Zeus, or any other god for that matter, was particularly good or kind or even righteous. But you see, that's the whole basis of Abraham boldly standing up to God. It's a profanity for you to do such a thing. Why? Because God is holy. Because God is good, because God is righteous, because God is fair, because God is just. Surely he won't treat the righteous as he would the wicked. That's perfectly fine for any other god in the ancient Near East or later Greece, but not the true God, not the God of Abraham. Here's my point, and this point could be made elsewhere in the Old Testament where God's justice is challenged, and it's challenged quite often. Underneath the boldness, underneath the pointed questions, underneath this arguing with God is an unshakable conviction in God's character. If God is like Zeus, if God is not holy, righteous, just, and good, then save your breath, Abraham. Save your breath. Underneath every lament or complaint or bold prayer in the Bible is a resolute trust in God's character. Now, what happens next, I'll just summarize, but Abraham begins haggling with God, the sort of haggling that might take place at a Middle Eastern bazaar. Abraham started out at 50, and then he worked his way down. He says, what about 45? You wouldn't destroy the city for lack of 5, would you? Okay, 45. 40? 40, fine. What about 30? Sure, 30. 20? Okay, 20. Final offer, 10. Would you do 10? Sure, 10. Deal. They shake on it and part ways. And now let's continue reading. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening. Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. And when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house. Spend the night, wash your feet. Then you can rise early, go on your way. They said, no, we'll spend the night in the square. But he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. You know, there's some discussion among Bible scholars about what this phrase, bring them out to us so that we may know them, means. It's been argued that the town was suspicious that the messengers were spies. Sodom had, after all, rebelled against the kingdoms of Mesopotamia earlier in Genesis 14. They were subsequently attacked and plundered, only to be rescued by Abraham. So the argument goes, that phrase, that we may know them, refers to their desire to interrogate the messengers and ensure that they aren't spies from the north. The problem with this interpretation is that the verb or word know, combined with a direct object, in this case them, occurs elsewhere in the Bible, and it never means to interrogate. It's rather a euphemism for sex. In addition, Lot then tried to appease the raving, lusting crowd by offering his daughters in their place. Verse 6, Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you. Do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they've come under the shelter of my roof. You know, we can seriously misread the Bible when we read the characters in the Bible through the simplistic moral lenses of good and bad. These are the good guys. These are the bad guys. And when we make those kinds of simplistic divisions, we get really confused. Because what do we then make of Lot's decision to sacrifice his daughters for the sake of his guests? If Lot is a good guy, well, then we're left to assume that was the right thing for him to do. But it wasn't. There is absolutely no indication anywhere in the Bible that this was the right thing for him to do. In this story, Lot is portrayed as good and bad. Good in comparison maybe to the rest of the city, good in his hospitality towards the strangers, good in his desire to protect his guests, but because Lot has chosen already to live in this wicked city, and by the way, that little detail in verse 1 of chapter 19 about Lot sitting at the gateway of Sodom, verse 1, it could actually indicate he was a leader in the city. because the gates of ancient cities served as the meeting places for the leaders to conduct business and make decisions about civic affairs. Anyways, Lot had chosen to live in this wicked city, and now, yes, he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. And what he chooses, remember, the Bible isn't condoning his decision, it's just relaying his decision. What he chooses is to discharge his duties as a good host and forfeit his duties as a good father. Fortunately for his daughters, it doesn't work. Verse 9, but they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien. He would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men, that is the messengers, inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men of the city who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Let me summarize what happened next. The messengers proceeded to warn Lot about what was to happen to Sodom if they didn't escape. Night passed, morning came. The messengers urged Lot to leave with his wife and 2 daughters. The text says that he hesitated. Again, Lot is a very complex figure. So they grabbed him and his family by their hands, led them outside the city, and told them to run for the hills. And finally, verse 24, then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. You know, if we learn this story in Sunday school, we might have this image of Lot's wife turning to look and then suddenly freezing midair, you know, like the characters turned to stone by the White Witch and the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What happened, most likely, is that Lot's wife didn't just look back, she turned back and even returned to Sodom. You can look up on your own sometime, Luke 17, 28 through 32. You'll see when Jesus remembers this story, he remembers Lot's wife to have turned back, not just glanced back. And so most likely, she turned back and thus suffered the same fate as the rest of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. She became a salt deposit, a monument to God's judgment in the region surrounding the Dead Sea. I don't know if I can read the crowd, but are we happy right now? I can't totally tell. Is there tension in the room? I want to talk about just a couple things in this story. I'll have to be very concise. I want to first talk to you about the necessity of justice. I'll have you know that there is no distinction in the Bible between the word judgment and the word justice. It's the same Hebrew word. You want justice, you always get judgment. You get judgment, you always get justice. The necessity of justice. One of the questions we might have when reading this story is, what exactly was Sodom's sin? What was so wicked about the city that would invite this devastating judgment? You know, tangled up in this question for us today, of course, is the modern issue of homosexual relationships. Is that what's going on in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? And actually, there are a couple other cities too, Admah and Zeboim, who were told in other parts of the Old Testament were part of God's judgment as well. The difficulty in answering yes to that question is that the men of Sodom, if we read our text closely, don't surround the house and ask Lot if they can court or date or romance the guests of his home. They ask for something far more brutal and violent. So we're left wondering, is it really same-sex attraction that fuels the men of Sodom, or is it a desire to utterly subjugate their visitors? Depending on how you answer that question will determine the relevance of this story to the issue of homosexuality. Now, there are a number of other places in the Bible where the sin of Sodom is spoken of. For instance, Jude 7 refers to it as sexual immorality. That's a general term that encompasses all types of sexual sin. It also says in that passage that they pursued other urges. That again is general. Matthew 10 and Luke 10 suggest their sin was inhospitality. Isaiah 1 suggests it was violence and bloodshed. Ezekiel 16 says the guilt of Sodom was pride, gluttony, and a disregard for the poor and vulnerable. Maybe it was all of these things. You know, the term used 3 times in our story to describe the problem that God's judgment or justice sought to address is the term outcry. God kept hearing an outcry. He wanted to go down and investigate whether what he saw matched the outcries that he kept hearing. Outcries in the Old Testament refer to the oppressed crying out because of mistreatment, think the Israelites in Egypt, or it refers to the victims of extreme violence, think the blood of Abel crying up from the ground in Genesis 4. The term outcry is the key to understanding the necessity of God's justice upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Whether it was extreme sexual abuse of vulnerable travelers, whether it was the blood of slain victims, perhaps even the cries of the rural poor by wealthy city dwellers, or whether it was all of those things. The sin of Sodom necessitated a response. Because when God hears an outcry, he can only be patient for so long. He has to act. There is a necessity to justice for the sake of the world. Now, I understand our discomfort with this concept and with the stories in the Bible that speak of God's judgment. I mean, if you are comfortable with, fire and sulfur raining down from heaven and obliterating everything underneath, I would wonder about your moral compass. I would wonder whether you've been formed by the person of Jesus. I understand the discomfort, but I also think we're a little bit too quick to judge the story, and a little too slow to let the story judge us. Because here's my question. So what do you do when you hear an outcry? Or do you not hear them? What kind of justice do you enact? Justice is not a feeling. Justice is not even a sense of fairness. Being fair, that concept of fairness, has far more to do with the biblical concept of righteousness rather than the biblical concept of justice. Justice in the Bible is when decisive and authoritative action is taken to right some wrong situation. So my question is, what do you do when you hear an outcry? What kind of justice do you enact? What kind of decisive and authoritative action do you take? Doing justice is very different from thinking justice or speaking justice, thinking justicey thoughts, saying justicey things, reposting justicey articles. Doing justice is when you take some situation that is upside down and with authority and decisiveness, you turn it right side up because those outcries demand a response. I've mentioned this to some of you before. Many years ago, I was at a conference, the largest annual biblical studies and theology conference in the world. So the top Bible scholars from all over are at this conference. Most sessions had between, 10, 50 attendees in the audience. But there was a main session that had a couple thousand. It's a big event. And a scholar had written a book titled God, a Biography. Pretty bold title. And he was explaining the book and talking about how God is portrayed throughout the Old Testament. And one of the comments he made during his presentation was that the dark parts in the Old Testament, the stories of judgment, whether the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Passover in Egypt, the conquest of Canaan, those dark parts, he said, were like the dark colors and dark spaces in a painting. The dark spaces in a painting are critical for enhancing and drawing the observer's attention to the lighter spaces, the bright and vibrant colors. The stories of judgment, his argument was, in the Old Testament work in a similar way. They serve to draw our attention and enhance the beauty of God's mercy, the stories of his patience, the stories of his forgiveness in the Old Testament, the bright and vibrant colors, the lighter spaces. I could feel a general agreement in the room. That sounded like a really good way to think about it. But during the response time, someone in the audience stood up and said something that ushered in a stunned silence across the room. He said, "I wonder if the way you equate the stories of judgment with the dark parts of the painting says more about you than it does about God. I wonder if it just betrays your own social location. Because if you were not comfortable and powerful and privileged, but rather oppressed and vulnerable and poor. Well, I think you'd read those stories differently. If you were the oppressed and poor, you'd think God's patience and forgiveness were the dark parts of the painting. You'd think God's judgments were the light. I don't remember what happened afterwards. God hears an outcry. He can only be patient for so long. He has to act. There is a necessity to God's judgment for the sake of the world. For the sake of the world. Second, the possibility of grace. One of the most interesting questions in this entire story is this: was Abraham's dialogue with God effective? Did it work? Because if it wasn't effective, well then, why was it written down? Why was it recorded? Why was it remembered? Isn't it odd? God tries to get God to consider another course of action and spare Sodom and Gomorrah, but apparently, because there weren't 10 righteous, God just ended up destroying the city anyways. Here's another way of asking the question. If you remove the interaction between God and Abraham in chapter 18 from the story, would it even matter? Would anything about the story be different? Now, you could argue that it did matter because God did end up sparing at least Lot and his 2 daughters. In fact, verse 29 of chapter 19 says that God remembered Abraham and so rescued Lot. But that could just mean that he remembered Abraham's concern for Lot. He remembered Abraham's relationship with Lot, Lot being his nephew. Not that he remembered the dialogue. And keep in mind, this is really important, Abraham argued not that God should spare the righteous when he judges the wicked. He argued and got God to agree with the idea of sparing the wicked on account of the righteous. That's a very different thing. Here's what I think. I think Abraham's dialogue with God is, of course, ineffective in sparing Sodom, obviously. But his dialogue is important, really important, in establishing something critical about judgment and grace. What Abraham does, and by the way, I do think that God invites it, right? Remember in the story, God decides to let Abraham in on his plan to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. God invites the dialogue, but what Abraham does is establish with God something really, really important. Everyone knows. In the ancient world, and if we think about it even today, everyone knows that the righteous get caught up in and suffer alongside the wicked. Everyone knows how the innocent get taken out by the guilty. Everyone knows the power of evil and guilt to determine the future for everyone. Just think for a moment about how an alcoholic father or a mean and spiteful mother or an abusive relative, can impact the future of generations, that impact the future of an innocent child. How many of us, decades later, are still trying to recover from what happened to us when we were young? Evil has this time-spanning, future-creating power. But what Abraham establishes with God, that everyone does not know, is that righteousness, right-relatedness, moral goodness, even of just a few, can impact the future even more. I don't think we should get caught up in the precise numbers. I don't think that the number 10 is the exact minimum number of righteous needed to spare the city. You'll notice Abraham, he could have gone lower. He didn't need to because the point was well established. The point is that the righteousness of a few has more time-spanning, future-creating power than the evil of the many. That's the point. The righteousness of a few has the power to open up for the many a future they don't deserve, to bring grace to the guilty. If everyone does know that the evil many can bring judgment upon the righteous few, what we learn in this dialogue is that the righteous few can bring grace to the guilty many. The prophet Isaiah talks about this very concept in a very famous passage in Isaiah 53. speaking not of a righteous few, but a righteous one. God says through the prophet, the righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous. He shall bear their iniquities. He bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. New Testament writers obviously could not help but see Jesus in this passage. Jesus as the righteous one who makes the guilty many righteous. Jesus as the one whose right relatedness to God opens up for the guilty many a future they don't deserve to bring grace. But what's interesting about Isaiah 53 is that the power of the righteous one is not restricted to grace toward sinners. See, earlier in Isaiah 53, it says, he, referring again to this righteous one, has borne our afflictions and carried our pain. By his wounds we are healed. Let me ask you, who's in pain? Who is afflicted? Who is wounded? Victims, right? The poor and oppressed, the abused and vulnerable and taken advantage of. The prophet is speaking of a future day when a righteous one would bring both grace to the perpetrator and healing to the victim. Not one or the other. Both. In other words, one day God would so act through this righteous one that the dark colors of the painting would be absorbed so that all would be light. For both victim and victimizer, for both the guilty who wreak havoc and the innocent crying in pain. And isn't that not just good news, but the best news? Because which category do you fall into? Are you just guilty and have no wounds caused by others? Are you just hurt and you have absolutely no guilt? Are you just sinful and you have absolutely no pain? Are you only victim and not victimizer? The prophet speaks of a day when God, through the righteous one, somehow, some way, would absorb the guilt and the judgment and open up a time-spanning, newly created future for everyone. And church, in Christ, He has. He has. And so if you need forgiveness this morning because of your sexual immorality, or because of your inhospitality towards outsiders, or because of your violence and rage, or because of your pride and your gluttony and your callous disregard for the poor, if you need forgiveness this morning because the sin of Sodom is the sin of you, throw yourself at the feet of the righteous one and claim the forgiveness that He made possible. If you need healing this morning because you've been sexually assaulted, because you've been the outsider who wasn't welcomed in, because you've been the victim of another's violent rage, because you've experienced callous disregard in your own poverty and vulnerability, throw yourself at the feet of the righteous one and claim the healing that He has made possible. Because what God has done for us in Jesus is absorbed all the dark and made possible only light. I want to invite the worship band to come back up here. And I want to invite you just into a moment of silent reflection. What do you need this morning? What do you need from the righteous one? Where do you find yourself in the story? What is stirring in your heart? Just spend a minute of silence and just interact with God. We're going to take communion now, so if you didn't receive communion on your way in, go ahead to that table back there, grab some for yourself or whoever you're sitting with. If you're joining with us online, we encourage you to grab some bread, a cracker, grape juice, wine, so that you can participate with us. That passage that you heard Dan so beautifully read earlier before I came up here, I don't know if you could catch it, but it actually is a reference to this story. Admah and Zeboim, those are two of the cities actually that were also judged along with Sodom and Gomorrah. They're all right around each other. And what's happening in Hosea 11 is that God is in this place of turmoil because what's happened is that his own people, because of their turn towards idolatry, have ended up in the same place as Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim. They're deserving of God's judgment. Not just deserving of God's judgment. They need God's judgment. There's a necessity for the same judgment and justice that he executed in Genesis 19. That's the situation that his people are in, according to Hosea 11. But of course, God, on the other hand, so desperately wants to show grace. And so we get an inside look, this like window into God's inner life. And God is recounting, he's remembering his time, his long time with Israel. And he says, how can I give you up, Ephraim? That's a reference to Israel. How can I hand you over? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? He's recalling the story. How can I do that again? And then right after it says, my heart recoils or changes within me. Now that word, translated recoils or changes, believe it or not, is the very Hebrew word that's used throughout our story in Genesis 19 to describe God's judgment. It's translated overthrow. Whether that suggests an earthquake or a meteor or whatever it is, volcanic activity, that's the word. It says that God overthrew. He overthrew. He overthrew. And what God is saying when he looks at his people, knowing they need judgment for the sake of the world, for the sake of all victims, but desperately wanting to show them grace, he says, my heart is overthrown within me. There is volcanic activity or earthquake or a meteor inside my inner life. The prophet is hinting at a day when the judgment and justice that was ours to bear would be turned in on himself. What we're looking at is both the justice and grace of God on our behalf.